Chapter 4. The apology never meant. Before the apology. For a quick summary of the past year. I had to repeat 9th grade for various reasons, partly because during 7th and 8th grade, I had very few classes, and I don't know why, since as far as I can remember, I could have managed to have more classes. Much as a consequence of that, I had to repeat 9th grade, something that became an enormous trauma, and an enormously long-lasting one, much also because I had already developed a self-hatred and now had to do one more year in the ASP class, completely without preparation. Had I had more lessons before then, I might not have needed it. Otherwise, I should have received an advance warning already in 7th or 8th grade that I'll probably have to repeat 9th grade, a lot for social reasons as well. In any case, it didn't have to hit me like a comet from hell. Then during the spring of 2007 I started exploring Umeå, both on the internet and physically. Then when school started again, I started to make friends outside the ASP class, and also outside of Bräntis, a lot with the help of Berget, the Ape Berg, the Facebook of the time, which I think only applied to the Umeå region, or at least primarily. I also got to visit a number of high schools, much since I would start going to one of them the next fall. On the other hand, my mental illness and self-image got much worse during 2007. Now I had become severely suicidal, and I told people a number of times in the ASP class, in front of both teachers and students. There were never any measures taken. Nobody ever told my parents about it. I recently asked my mom about it, April 2021 that is. I also never told them, since unlike 5th grade, this was for real. I also introduced myself very poorly to everybody on Berget. I didn't utter one single word about elementary. I was the victim of victims. And even if the misery got to take a pause during early 2008, the worst was yet to come. We'll get to that real soon. Now I had started 9th grade over again. Now I got to have art class, gym, math, music, Swedish and wood class with a normal class, 9E. We also had 2 new kids in the ASP class, one of which never attended class. He just sat all day in a basement attached to the ASP class. I had some classes there myself during 8th grade, and I also got to paint the walls in that room with a roller. Another one was an essential computer nerd. He got to use the computer all day, literally. He never attended class. He even ate lunch in front of the computer at times, with the plate on the keyboard and stuff. One thing that bugged me was that this kid was allowed to use the computer all day without any interference from the teachers. I, on the other hand, never skipped class and never ate lunch in front of the computer, but yet people were bothered by my computer usage during 7th and 8th grade only because I was violating the computer rules. It wasn't okay for me to break the rules, but it was okay for this kid to skip all classes all because he never broke the rules. Talk about alcohol/pharma versus cannabis. I can't breathe. I remember the whole class sitting at the big round table in the ASP classroom at the very beginning of this fall term. The head teacher said that we had to understand each other since we all had ASP and some problems along with it. Then he went on to say that the kid who sat in the basement all day had, quote, the full right to do so. Okay then, but then why wasn't I allowed to violate the computer rules despite attending all classes? You see, these kids were allowed to skip all classes, but I wasn't allowed to violate the rules despite attending all classes. Yeah, I did strike for 1-2 weeks at the end of 7th grade, but that was only because this guy threatened to snitch on me. Nowadays I fully understand why I wasn't allowed to break the computer rules, given the fact that they were put up by powers much higher than the teachers. Nor did I gain much actually out of breaking them. It was more that I had beef with this guy and then crossed over to better things, totally without breaking the rules. But still it bugs me that these kids got to cut all classes, especially he who sat with the computer all day. Above the fact that they never got as far as me socially, but they also fell off academically, much more so than I did for other reasons. At least I kept my classes. Now, let's fast forward to the spring of 2008. Until the Tuesday of April 15th, everything rolled on like it had for the last months. But during that day, something unexpected happened. On my way to lunch, I bumped into 4 girls I'd known for a while. They told me that they had just met the guy the first had beef with downtown. I asked, do you mean insert name? First I thought they meant somebody else with the same first name, but then they confirmed that it was the guy who snitched threatened me back in 7th grade. They went on to tell me that he was, quote, better than me because he was being, quote, himself, which I now suddenly wasn't according to them. As I see it, They meant that he was being himself because he was a quote, typical Aspie, meaning, nerdy, obsessed with existing rules and uninterested in the outside world, and he was not alone about that amongst the ASP class students, while I wasn't being myself because I hated the ASP class and hung with minorities like I had done lately. I got real surprised when they told me about the guy. How could they possibly know about him? I assumed they'd found out about my beef with him. I remember writing a little about it on Op Budget the last fall, but I never mentioned his name and I wrote so little about him anyway. I don't think I even wrote that he threatened me. I just simply wrote that he bullied me. So how could they possibly know about him? The next day, the bullshit continued. I remember heading towards the Oasis right after lunch. I used to hang there almost every day after lunch. There I met these 4 girls. I told them I had beef with the guy because he bullied me back in 8th grade, but I didn't say more than that. Then they told me I was weird for hating the ASP class despite having ASP myself in going there. Then they went on to say that the guy had smoked cigarettes with them, which I found hard to believe since I knew he was involved in an anti-tobacco organization called Tobacco Free Duo. I thought they already understood why I hated the ASP class, after having written so much about it on Op Budget for the last 6 months. I was real disappointed in them. One of them also told me that the guy would show up at Williams Gordon the coming weekend, both Friday and Saturday. Williams Gordon is the youth center at Oldham, and I'd been there almost every weekend for the last few months. I couldn't tell if she was lying or not. Later it would turn out that he never put foot in that place. It was quite obvious now that she lied, probably trying to make me not come there. Things would get a lot worse real soon. Later when I got home, I wrote a short text that I would post on Op Budget. First I wrote that I was bullied by the guy back in 8th grade. In the text, I named him Bailey, after the bully Eminem rapped about in Brain Damage. I was madly stupid though for not writing about him threatening me. I also wrote that those 4 girls had told me about him and that he was better than me for being quote, himself, and how disappointed I was in them for that. Then I can remember the second half of this text almost exactly as I wrote it. But that's okay, because they're nothing but 4 little whores who don't know who they're dealing with. I still got all the other blats. And I'll also be able to move to any city I want in the future, change my name and appearance, make new blat friends and lie about my childhood. Blat is my translation of blatte, which is a casual reference to a person of color, but it can at times be derogatory. It was commonly used in Sweden back in these days. In more recent years, I at least have replaced it with racialized, since that's become more common, and is more suitable and dignified. I was mad stupid for writing down my future plans. It's quite obvious that if you're planning to change your name and lie about your childhood, you keep it to yourself. I was also mad stupid for taking my relationship with minorities for granted, especially since I'd only known them for about 3 or 4 months. But the greatest mistake of all was to ever mention the H word, or W word for that matter. I didn't see it as a big deal at the time, but I should have known the danger I was putting myself in. That alone would turn my life upside down eternally. The next day, the Thursday of April 17th, I got confronted by the girls. It happened during the first 10-minute recess I think. Pretty much everyone had class, the hallways were totally empty. Then right after lunch, I bumped into the head teacher and then he took me to his office. We had a discussion about what had just happened. He told me that calling the girls the H word was illegal and that I had to remove the text as soon as possible, or else they would press charges, or sick the guys from Oldham on me, one of which even were one of the girls' boyfriend. Already then, I knew very well that these guys ain't nothing to fuck with. That's something I surely should have thought about at first. The head teacher actually did the right thing right here. He also told me if I got arrested and tried, my disability would affect the trial heavily, which would then ruin my quote, image. He also told me I'd have to return to the quote, ASP life, isolated in my suburban home. I wouldn't even be able to go downtown. He put it that way very much word for word, as if my whole life had been that way even during elementary. That was very unnecessary, even though it was true that it could be the case from now on. But it hadn't been the case my whole life. A few minutes later, I changed the text. The sentence that included the H word got changed into this, but that's okay, because they don't know who they're dealing with. The rest of the text was left unchanged. Then when I got home, I wrote a new text where I explained further why I got so upset over what had just happened. I also apologized for calling them the H word. Then at about 8 p.m., my parents brought up a discussion with me about all this. They'd just been told what had happened. I remember my mother being real worried about me. She was worried I would get beaten to death or stabbed if I went to Gordon the coming weekend. She was also worried that somebody would come home to us looking for me. Then I had to show the texts to my parents. My parents got upset about me having written, but that's okay, because they don't know who they're dealing with. They told me that could be interpreted as a threat and I could be convicted of even that. Eventually they told me to remove both texts, which I did. Then they suggested that I stayed home from school on Friday. I was a little scared of those girls, but I still went to school as usual. But I couldn't go to Gordon that weekend. It was way too dangerous now. The next week, the Monday of April 21st, I bumped into some girls at the Oasis right after lunch. One of these was one of those I had beef with now, but the others had nothing to do with it. I remember her telling me to apologize to her and the other 3 girls face to face. I told her I'd already apologized on Op Burgett, but then she said that wasn't enough. That made me think that maybe I shouldn't have apologized at Op Burgett to begin with, since that may have triggered them to require a face-to-face apology. But at the same time, I should have apologized to them face-to-face, willingly. Then she went on to tell me she'd found out, quote, the real reason why I had beef with the guy. She told me I was wrong for being mad at him for not letting me watch porn. Porn? I'd never once touched porn. Now I was real surprised and confused. I also got real disappointed in her for being mad at me for being mad at the guy for snitch threatening me. And I thought people in the hood hated snitches. That's what made me want to hang with them in the first place. Something was wrong here. Later the same day, I told the head teacher that this girl knew about everything that happened between me and the guy. Then the head teacher told me he had told her everything, unlike me who made a mistake by not telling the whole story. The head teacher had told her that the guy snitch threatened me for violating the computer rules. That's how she found out. Then I told the head teacher that she wanted a face-to-face apology. I can't remember the rest of this discussion, but it seems that he actually told her the full truth, which I should have done first. He didn't lie to her just to make my situation worse. That porn stuff was simply just something she made up. Later that day, right before going home, the head teacher came up to me and said that all the girls wanted a face-to-face apology. Now I got real worried and anxious. Like I said before, being forced to apologize for something I didn't actually regret was pretty much my life's greatest fear at the time. But on the other hand, I did regret it now since that mistake had put me in this situation. For the rest of that week, I spent about an hour in his office every day, except for Friday. I can't remember much other than us planning how I would apologize to the girls. We eventually decided I would apologize on Friday, 12 sharp. He told me I'd gain nothing out of not apologizing. I'd only end up abandoned and bullied, maybe even jumped by some. I remember him telling me that the girls would feel guilty in the future if I just apologized. He told me one of them might have a disabled child in the future, and then feel guilty for bullying me. Well, I've seen them a number of times since I left high school, and most often they haven't even noticed me. But I did see one of them a few times as late as 2014, and then another one of them sometime during 2016. Every time we passed, she either gave me the same old sneer or said, "Hi Jonathan," in the same sneery way. By this time she hadn't changed one bit since 2008. I remember one time during this week, Wednesday I think, while being at the Oasis, somebody told me he'd met some guys from Oldham and that he'd been told I didn't have to worry about them. Then I told the head teacher about this, and then he told me that this was one of the most unreliable kids at school. I believed him since I didn't trust this guy too much either. Plus, I was still afraid of the guys from Oldham. I just had to choose the safe side of this. I also remember the head teacher criticizing me for writing negatively about, quote, my own people with ASP that is. He also told me that writing negatively about people with ASP or Asperger syndrome only made me more, quote, ASP, like I would become less retarded by writing positively about it. That doesn't make sense to me here. He clearly meant that I shouldn't write about it at all. But that doesn't make sense to me neither. Does telling the truth about ASP make me more retarded? Does rapping negatively about cops make rappers more like cops? Whatever, he just tried to make me not want to write about ASP. Not much later I learned not to care less whether writing and publishing these songs, these posts in this book makes me more or less retarded. The only thing that matters is I'm being true to myself. I'm not lying about my childhood just to make myself look like a neurotypical ghetto kid. Nor am I feeling sorry for myself just because I got ASP or grew up middle class. That's the only thing that matters at the end of the day. He once said, I think during the same conversation, quite exactly that if a pedophile gets placed in a public ward in a prison among other quote, ordinary criminals, robbers, dealers, murderers etc., he'll get beaten by everyone and the guards will just turn their backs. After that he said, less exactly but still, that I also risked getting beaten out in the streets if I continued speaking out about the ASP class, since that would mean I would insult the disabled and upset people that way. As if I couldn't explain what it was really about, that I myself had that diagnosis, and in today's retrospect other unofficial ones, and was being exposed to misconduct, both inside and outside the class. How could that be compared with, for example, these girls now bullying me? Even more so, how could that be compared to child molestation? Isn't this more comparable to something like, for example, Edward Snowden? I can also remember the head teacher telling me that just like I might have a hard time understanding neurotypical youth, they might also have a hard time understanding me for being disabled. I wonder, is everything that happens to me caused by ASP? Everything that happens in someone's life doesn't necessarily have to be caused by a disability, if you have one that is. The girl's decision to backstab me, or my decision to call them the H-word, doesn't have to have been caused by my disability. And even if that would ever play a part in anything, it doesn't necessarily have to be negative. I'll get back to that later. I can also remember him telling me that the girls have the right to hang with whoever they want, and that I had no say in it. Well, throughout this entire school year, he'd constantly told me not to hang with minorities. I wonder, did he ever have a say in that? By the way, it didn't bother me much that the girls bumped into the guy itself. The real problem was that they used him against me, which they did successfully, at least in the beginning. Despite all the hatred I'd developed against the head teacher since 7th grade, I trusted him this time, and it wasn't like I hadn't regained trust in him temporarily earlier. On top of him being neurotypical, he also had much more experience with youth/minorities than me. That's why I expected him to help me, but that was really just because I couldn't trust myself better. Indeed, he was right about most of what he said, but I also felt like he was enjoying the situation I'd been put in, both by them and myself, which I became more strongly convinced about later. On the Friday of April 25, 12 sharp, I came to his office. For the first few minutes, we were there alone. I remember saying something like, "What about them?" Then he said, "This is about what you've done. What they've done is something totally different." It looked so obviously as if he wanted me to be so severely punished for my little mistake, almost like a rapist, while he wanted those girls to get away with everything they'd done already and would do later. Then they showed up. I sat on a chair in front of the others, full of shame and fear. First the head teacher and the girls had a conversation. I can't remember anything they said, but I do remember very clearly how they smiled at each other, in a quote, ass-kissing way. Then I had to apologize. I think I said exactly this. "Okay, now I'd like to apologize to all of you for calling you 4 little whores. But after everything you've done to me, I don't think we could ever be friends again." Then that was it, but at the same time, everything had just begun. From then on, the girls bullied me daily. I couldn't be out in the hallways, or with others, without them harassing me. Every time we happened to be at the same place, they tried to discreetly approach me unnoticed, all just to provoke me. I got scared to death, 'cause I knew that if I ever did anything quote, wrong, again, I'd end up abandoned, bullied and or jumped by the others, which I still got along with. That made me feel totally hopeless and helpless. It also made me feel betrayed by all the others, as if it was their fault. They never got to know what truly happened. I never got to tell my version of it all. I expected the girls to leave me alone after having apologized to them, but I was dead wrong. I realize now that I should have apologized to them at random willingly, instead of letting them push me into a corner. Then I could have asked them how they knew about the guy, what they knew about him and why they thought he was better than me. The head teacher should have demanded that from them. But then of course, I never should have mentioned the H-word. After the apology, I had quite many discussions with the head teacher in his office about all this. On the Monday of April 28th, I remember asking him what to do next. Then he said, "You don't have to hang with the Blats. You don't have to hang at Oleum's Gordon. But if you choose to keep going this way, Then this is what you get. I remember being real bothered by his voice tone for some reason. I was enraged, but I kept it inside saying nothing but, of course I have to. I have no choice. I refused to give up on the hood no matter what the girls did. This discussion made me feel like the head teacher wanted me to give up on them, using my beef to try to make me do so. As a result of the beef, the head teacher and my parents suggested I'd stay away from Williams Gordon for some time. I don't quite blame them actually. The head teacher suggested I would go to Marieham's Gordon in Mariehamn instead, which I did on May 2nd or 3rd. I'd been there a few times last winter. But this time I only met a few whites there, so I left and never came back. I remember leaving Harton right after the guy showed up. The head teacher called me a coward. Now he wanted me to leave Williams Gordon for the exact same reason, and he didn't call me a coward this time when I avoided the place. It felt like it was quite obvious which path he wanted me to go. It felt quite obviously like he was hoping this beef would make me leave the hood for good. On May 23rd or 24th, I returned to Williams Gordon. I remember a guy telling me he wasn't out to get me, that everything was cool. It seemed like the guy at Bräntis was right all along, but I still doubt that everything would have been cool had I not apologized. I don't blame myself or even the head teacher for not trusting him. This became a real good evening, especially since none of those girls showed up. But put that aside, one of them was there almost every weekend for the rest of this spring. She was a pain in the ass every time. I was constantly worried that somebody would go after me simply because she told him to. I never saw the other girls at Williams Gordon after the apology though. I met one of them only once right outside the place, before the beef. I saw another one at the place not once. I remember having a discussion with the head teacher in the ASP classroom in front of everybody else. I asked if it was legal to write a book about all of this in the future. Then I got an answer from the head teacher which I remember very poorly, but he said something like that I could be convicted of slander if I wrote anything about anybody that could be insulting. Then I replied with something about freedom of speech, that I also remember very poorly. Then he said something quite alike this. Freedom of speech, young man, is for politics and society. It's not for calling people names. Youth have a hard time understanding the true definition of freedom of speech. I got real mad but kept silent in order to not lose control. What exactly did he mean by quote, politics and society? Then he said exactly this, you want restitution. But if you ever want to let go of that grudge, you're probably gonna have to struggle. Then he left the room. Now I was murderously enraged, angrier than I'd ever been in my entire life so far. I was so close to losing it but I still managed to keep it inside. Who was he to ever use the word, struggle, in that context? He meant that I was supposed to quote, struggle, against my grudge against the guy, instead of truly struggling to keep it and make something positive out of it. Already then I'd heard the word quite often in rap songs. That's why I got so enraged when he used it in the wrong context. But at the same time, I should have realized a long time ago that I was supposed to embrace the hatred instead of trying to throw it away in vain. I'd chosen the wrong path in life. But all this that happened with the girls and all was the beginning of a long, good self-reflection that would change my life forever, for better and worse but worth it. On the other hand, I could agree I've had to struggle to not walk around angry all the time just for the sake of it. But that's only an inner peace well earned by truly struggling since then. But on the other hand, I'd pretty much already dropped everything about the guy, but then those girls came around to truly ruin my life for years ahead. That's why I've had to struggle just to be able to breathe. As you probably see now, I've also had to struggle because I got a clear message that this particular book is outright illegal, that this entire website is illegal. I remember a conversation I had in the head teacher's office where I asked him if I could call people ugly words in public posts and writings, of course without mentioning names. Then he said, but you cannot take the law into your own hands, and shortly after I'd said something he repeated the exact same words. I remember this conversation extremely poorly since I wrote about it just now in April 2021, but it clearly contributed to the idea that this was illegal, which explains why I didn't write this earlier. He never suggested that I went to talk to any lawyers about what boundaries exist and can exist. Now it couldn't be more obvious that he really wanted me to perish. As a teacher, you have a responsibility to give your students hope for the future. But enough that I had slowly but surely lost more and more over the last few years, this became the nail in the coffin. It would only become more obvious a few years later. One time during this spring term, before this beef started, while I was having lunch, the head teacher walked up to me and told me some authority had contacted him regarding my texts on Op Budget. He told me he was worried that the ASP class would get shut down. Even to this day, I can remember how he practically begged me for mercy, how he seemed to fear me. I felt so powerful for once. Sometime later, probably the same day, he told me that if the ASP class got shut down, I'd have to go, quote, back to Bräntbergsskolan. I also remember him telling me that I belonged to Bräntbergsskolan. I interpreted this as the head teacher trying to convince me I somehow belonged to that school simply because I lived in that neighborhood. Except for my sister, about 2 years younger, and her best friends, I knew absolutely nobody from that school. Meanwhile, I already knew so many people at Bräntis and even Bräntbergsskolan. As of this moment, I'd never put my foot at Bräntbergsskolan. I did later that same spring when my family watched a concert called the Grubbe Review, where several kids from that school, including my sister, performed. We were also there the next spring, but except for these 2 concerts, I've never put my foot in that place. The beef with the guy was always a small thing, and became ever more the case due to the girls. I got far enough just for hanging out with minorities right before then. Now I got bullied for real, for a very long time. The head teacher seemed to believe I was only angry at the guy, without taking into consideration everything else I had to be angry about. And it wasn't about just the girls, and certainly not San Andreas. I also had ASP and everything that brought. Pretty much all of junior high had been stolen from me because of that and all the loneliness and self-hatred it brought. It seems like that never crossed the head teacher's mind. One thing that got on my nerves quite often was that the head teacher could be real nasal/falsetto-like in his voice. He often talked about the importance of talking to people the right way, but he never took a look at himself in terms of how he talked to people, I thought. For a long time after graduation, I dwelled on some things he said much due to how he said it. Hearing his voice in my brain, which I did constantly throughout most of high school, was like eating junk food. I can't find any better way to describe it. I also remember him as a strong propagandist for ASP and its pros, like it was ever worth the cons. I remember us once a year having a quiz with about 50 questions called Orientation of the Present, which the entire county, if not the entire country, had. I remember during my 3rd and 4th round that he said the ASP class was so, quote, superior to everyone else out there, simply because we generally had better points than them and that we were so well-mannered, while everybody else out there were so rowdy, because they always skipped class and had fights and stuff, like there weren't any kids in the ASP class who also skipped class. Maybe he only meant well by trying to make us feel some dignity, but the dangerous part about this was that pretty much all the kids went to normal classes during elementary and many were probably bullied. That in combination with the fact that they found some kind of comfort zone in the ASP class probably made them relate strongly to what the head teacher said. That probably affected them negatively and made them develop some kind of us versus them mentality. Something like this never once happened in elementary, I can promise. We were just kids, just as innocent as all the other kids in the schoolyard. Then when Mom told me I had ASP when I was 12, it was nothing at all to me. He also said a couple of times during my last 2 years at Bräntis that Asperger's never goes away, but you can learn to handle it. I couldn't really decide how to interpret it then, but as of today I interpret it as possibly meaning that you can never get rid of ASP from within if you have the diagnosis, only mask it. Personally, I believe I've managed to get rid of a lot of ASP from within year after year, and that I got rid of a lot of it already in elementary, unless I already then had less of it than many others. But there is one thing that never goes away, and that's trauma. It can be processed like everything else, let alone various diagnoses. I ain't always been as much ADHD, for example, but trauma really stays with you in one way or another. I've truly learned that the hard way in recent years as a Muslim and all. Given that the head teacher now said that ASP never goes away, he should have taken into consideration that my resentment towards the guy and even more these girls would never go away, at least not for a while, and much less by any turn-off button. I've always liked comparing people with ASP with criminals and drug addicts, which has been easy thanks to me knowing so many criminals and addicts. And whether you talk about that time or the present, these thugs are way more well-mannered and successful than people with ASP. They have much better resources in life. They got their homies and their experiences. People with ASP are just empty and pathetic. but I think it's mainly because they're neurotypical, or have diagnoses other than ASP. It ain't like they're above all the law-abiding, educated non-whites and whites as well. They are much more well-mannered and successful than both the others here, both academically and socially. All this ASP propaganda that the head teacher pushed made me develop a very black and white worldview, some kind of hood versus ASP mentality. Well, my life is I've lived it now, and all of these mass shootings and such is strong proof that I was actually right all along. Being racialized, underclass, having another diagnose, or being even just an average white boy, is way better than an ASPy. He also suggested a few times that I would move to Silicon Valley in California and work there. Silicon Valley is well known for all its high-tech companies, and thus there should be a strong nerd factor and thus a potential ASP factor there. What the head teacher meant here was that I would fit in there only because I got ASP. I can't decide whether he was joking or not, but of course I got offended. He had already introduced me to Jacob Holt, and like I said before, he often pointed out how I had it so good only because I lived in the suburbs with an ordinary, white middle-class family, with the possible intention to make me feel pathetic and inadequate. Sometime during May, I started walking around downtown Umeå for about an hour every Friday right after school, and even every Saturday around the same time of the day. I did it to be outdoors more, be more around people, and also potentially gain more contact with people, just in case I bumped into them, that is. Now when I think about it, I could have done this easily any time sooner for the same reason, which I did though the last summer. Then it would have mattered less that I lived in Grubbe instead of the hood on the other side of town, something that bugged me a lot through the years, since I would have had about the same distance from downtown anyway. Plus, people from all parts of town, including surrounding small towns, and of all ages go there. One Friday during May, while being downtown right after school, I bumped into two of those girls. They showed me a picture they had taken with a cell phone. It was one of the girls and the guy on the photo, with one of them having his or her arm around the other one's shoulders. Now they'd proven that they did really bump into him. They didn't lie about that part at least. In mid-June, we had our graduation. It was raining, so we had to have it indoors in the canteen instead of outdoors as planned. I was glad it was raining, since I was so sad about the beef with the girls and all. Sunshine didn't exactly fit my mood right now. This would be the last time I ever put my foot at Bräntis for a long time. I remember stopping by one time during the fall of 2008, bumping into a few kids on the backside, without entering the school. I've also visited the school a few times, in 2011, 12, 13 and 16, when it's been temporarily inhabited by foreign soccer kids who participated in the yearly soccer festival at the end of July, when the school's been open but had no school staff. I've also rolled past the place hundreds of times on the bike. After graduation, during my time in the ASP class, I had to endure a lot of ASP propaganda, meaning that ASP was romanticized without regard to the obvious misery it caused, and that some kind of culture was formed which in turn led to one being branded by his diagnosis, and thus increasingly limited by it. For me, the branding and the isolation became all the more obvious, something I didn't notice at all back in elementary. Back then, my classroom looked just like any other classroom, but in junior high, the classroom was located right next to one of the entrances, completely separate from the rest of the school. It may have been necessary or at least better that way, but you were basically just kept there, waiting to start high school instead of being allowed to develop gradually during junior high. And the label would seemingly last a lifetime, no matter how far you got in life. Then there was never any emphasis on the diet, a big concern for many with ASP, which it was for me as well. ASP gives you many unfounded fixations at an early age, including those regarding food. As a result, many of us received special diets, meaning our own lunchboxes separated from the buffet at lunch. I, for example, never ate vegetables, but I was never truly allergic to them. As a consequence, I was malnourished, and it clearly worsened my development and chances at a normal life, something that can hardly be blamed on being born with ASP. At the kitchen class, I never got to deal with vegetables and more advanced dishes, only with very basic dishes such as pancakes, fried eggs, scones, etc. As far as I remember, we had the same tasks at kitchen class at Bergum, if not more advanced actually. We who now were special school children in elementary. The purpose of the ASP class was that the students would be reasonably challenged on the way out to society, but instead they only got a comfort zone, a victim's cardigan, as we call it in Swedish. The teachers could easily have challenged us appropriately regarding the diet for the same reason as all the other tasks, many of which I disapproved of but still endured out of a pure sense of duty and responsibility. They should have taken our bad diet much more serious and been more educated about it. Quite comparable to me having a cigarette without anybody reacting. On the other hand, I've never had one once in my life. Then it was never said that I could have ADHD and or possibly catch it and other disabilities later in life as a consequence of my circumstances, which was also true. I remember there were some students with both ASP and ADHD. Personally, I think I should have been diagnosed with ADHD as well, much in connection to all the times I ran from Bergam. But I don't take for granted that everything would have gone right just because of that, now since my ASP was already treated so badly. After everything that happened with those girls, I decided not to make a new pre-planned post on Op Budget. On top of all that, my future plans changed drastically. Now did I not only want revenge on the guy and the head teacher. Now I wanted revenge on those girls too. Therefore, I had to change my future plans. I still wanted to lie about my childhood, but now I had to include those girls in my story. I quickly came up with a new but also even more twisted idea. My real self would be a third person in my story while I wanted to play the fictional character growing up in Mariehamn. My life was exactly the same as in reality. I started hanging with minorities during fall 2007 and spring 2008. Along the way, I got to know this guy who had grown up with them. For a long time, I believed that the guy and the girls founded a pact against me. But later in life, I realized that the guy was actually never involved in this. The girls bumped into him in downtown, but that was it. He was never involved in anything. He never knew what the girls did to me. The girls were just using him against me. But then the question remains, how did they ever find out who he was? And then, how did they find out about our old beef, if they even knew about it to begin with? I remember the head teacher telling me that the girls could have gotten some information from another girl who had some normal classes with the guy and thus knew him a little. But I really don't believe she had anything to do with this. I met her a few times at Mariehamn's Gordon, but that was it. The head teacher also told me the girls bumped into the guy back in fall 2005 or spring 2006 already, when I was in 8th grade. That's actually very possible. For a long time, I also believed that the head teacher and the girls had founded a pact against me. It certainly looked much like it, especially since the head teacher told one of them why I had beef with the guy, plus the way the girls and the head teacher smiled at each other right before I apologized. But it was really just that he seemed to be enjoying the situation that the girls had created themselves, but which I also had helped make worse. Then it was also that the girls made me feel alienated from the whole hood like the guy made me feel alienated from the ASP class. The difference now was only that the guy could have never reached me outside of the ASP class, or at least not outside of Bräntis. He could have never robbed me of all the security I found in the hood like the girls did. Their bullying would stretch out all over Bräntis, Oldham, and then throughout high school. They made me want to crawl back to the retarded cesspit that the guy and even the head teacher practically forced me out of accidentally. They forced me to keep putting up with degradation and humiliation, after having managed to escape it. The girls did everything the guy and the head teacher couldn't. They could easily turn all minorities against me unlike the other two. But later in life, I realized that the girls only did this for themselves most likely. But then I gotta ask why. What did I do wrong before the H word? Maybe it was that I stalked one of them in the spring of 2007. Possibly, but unlikely. We'd become quite good friends after all, I thought. But since the bullying only continued and worsened after the apology, it's quite obvious that their purpose from the very beginning was to destroy me. But my mistake by dropping the H-bomb gave them the possibility to take their bullying to a much higher level. It seems like they were happy I made that mistake. 'Cause if I didn't, this would have never gotten this bad. Since I was forced to apologize for something I didn't actually regret, I felt unworthy of all the cred, like I had sold myself out, like I couldn't stand for something. Calling a bunch of girls the H-word obviously wasn't anything to stand for or be proud of, but it was really just about not letting myself be bullied or humiliated. Unfortunately, I didn't know how to defend myself against them, especially not now when the worst had already happened. It became like a big black cloud that would follow me for a very long time, even though the worst would end much sooner than expected. Then it was also that it was pretty much my life's greatest fear to apologize for something I didn't actually regret. I think it was implanted in me very early in life. We're talking kindergarten and elementary. As small children, we're forced to say sorry every time we insult or hurt somebody, but we're never taught to feel empathy and regret, and then apologize willingly with a straight spine. I remember one time reading a Bombsy comic, a Swedish cartoon about a bear hero using honey like steroids, where a couple of thieves were forced to apologize to the store clerk in the store they had just robbed, in order to avoid prison. I believe things like that have a very negative influence on small children. That was very much the reason I couldn't or lacked the guts to apologize willingly with a straight spine, instead of letting myself get pushed into a corner. But besides that, I really can't blame myself one bit for apologizing at all after having called them the H word. I just couldn't afford to put up the fight. I was doomed to lose. As a result of this beef, I started interpreting rap songs somewhat differently. Before the beef, I was too busy feeling inadequate, pathetic and worthless, blaming it all on being disabled and middle class. I couldn't relate to rap songs. I was too busy wishing I was a neurotypical ghetto kid, like that alone would fix everything. But after this beef started, I started interpreting rap songs somewhat differently. Now I could relate to some extent. I think it was thanks to the seriousness of it all, that it really wasn't a small thing like the guy or San Andreas. Then it was also that I had racialized friends, and a generally more normal life. Here are a few examples of songs that became specifically important to me around this period and a while ahead. Pretty Much Everything by Block 44. Gangstar, Moment of Truth. Gangstar featuring Scarface, Betrayal. Ghetto Boys, I Tried. Eddie Kendricks, Each Day I Cry a Little, sampled in I Tried. And Gil Scott-Heron, Home is Where the Hatred Is. I might add that even before the beef, I often listened to old-school hip-hop such as Gangstar and Ghetto Boys, whose entire albums were already then uploaded on YouTube. Those girls on the other hand mainly listened to contemporary, mainstream, auto-tune crap. I remember them often playing and singing songs like, Buy You a Drink, Crank That Soldier Boy, Low, and, Walk It Out. Already then, I'd learned to dislike mainstream hip-hop, largely thanks to Nobody Smiling. I also was a little suspicious of them before the beef, much because they listened so excessively to that mainstream crap. I guess I shouldn't have been so surprised when they turned on me like this. I should have never been so much around them. They were quite obviously bad company from the start, put aside the fact that they were the ones who pretty much introduced me to all the other guys. But from then on, I think I could have made it without them really, which I have successfully since all this. Of course things would have been easier hadn't I had beef, but if I wasn't so dependent on them in the beginning, perhaps things wouldn't have gotten as bad later. I also started interpreting Malcolm X's speeches differently. He often spoke about blacks hating themselves and wanting to be white, and that they should be proud to be black. Before the beef, I interpreted that as him saying that I should be proud to have ASP. But then starting from the beef, I started interpreting it a little as him saying I should be proud to be racialized, although now I clearly wasn't. But at the end of the day, it was all along just about personality traits and life experience, in which I was always superior to my classmates. I could have and should have made the most of that. I also remember him speaking about the house slave. A house slave was a black person working for the master, and at the same time being spoiled by him. He got to live with him in his house, he got good food and good clothing. The other slaves, the field slaves, worked out on the plantation. They lived in small huts, ate chitlins, pig guts that is, wore trash for clothing and got whipped by the master. The master used the house slave to manipulate and control the field slaves and thus keep them from escaping. That speech reminded me a little of my own situation. The girls were like the house slave, while the other guys who I still got along with were like the field slaves. The head teacher was like the slave master. I couldn't determine my role in all this at first, but then I came to the conclusion that I was either a quote, white field slave, or a free white man who helped the black slaves escape, risking his life. I would learn many years later, from an Immortal Technique interview, that there were actually white slaves. That's how the word redneck was coined, since they got their red necks from sunburn. And I also learned from a conversation between Alex Jones and KRS-One that there were also free whites helping black slaves escape, risking and sometimes even losing their lives. As a result of the beef, this summer became real long and real sorrowful. I often thought it was all the minorities' fault, like they forced me to apologize. That made me often consider becoming a neo-Nazi. Sometimes I even considered becoming a cop, or joining the Swedish army in Afghanistan. Whenever I experienced these considerations, it was like a nightmarish psychosis. I became totally numb and cold-hearted. I experienced it about once or twice a month until the summer of 2009. These moments lasted for about 5 minutes, and when they ended, I became very humbled and ashamed over having been so cold-hearted and evil. I'd always been so positive about hip-hop, hoods and minorities. It was just that I became so surprised and disappointed when all this happened. I took for granted that the hood would fix everything for me. It was probably just that I felt excluded and betrayed by the hood, like the beef with the guy made me feel the same about the ASP class. That's also very much the reason people become Nazis. They usually come from broken homes and search for friendship early, just like any type of criminals. They usually also grew up in the hood and were often bullied by minorities, only to then join other whites with similar backgrounds. Then it was probably all of my self-hatred. As life got better, my mind also got better obviously. During late April, all 9th graders got a second chance to choose high school programs after having done that once. This time, I switched places between Östra Gymnasiet and UIG, Umeå International Gymnasium. Now, social studies at Östra was my second-hand choice and social studies at UIG was my third-hand choice. But music production at Bräntbergsskolan was still my first-hand choice. The first reason for that was that I was very unlikely to ever make it to Midgård. The music production program only had space for 13 students and required at least 215 points. I was expected to have 210 points by graduation, so making it was possible but still unlikely due to the lack of space. I finally got 205 points. The second reason for keeping Midgård my first-hand choice was that to some extent, I wanted to go through music production, and thus I was willing to sacrifice Östra for Midgård. Back then, I believed that the quote, right education was more important than the right school. This because there were plenty of racialized students at Östra but hardly any at Midgård. Had I not wanted to lie about my childhood, it would have been more important to go to the right school. Many people around me had been critical during the last year about me wanting to go to Östra, for better and worse. I fully understand the educational part, but I can't help but think there were racist undertones behind it. I remember one time during this spring term, before the beef once again, having a discussion with the head teacher about the high school choice. We were for the moment alone in the ASP classroom. I can't remember much other than him saying something like I was ridiculous for wanting to go to Östra simply because of the minorities there, are quote, immigrant kids and black girls, as he put it word for word. Okay, but how ridiculous wasn't it then that Jacob Holt went around in American major city ghettos in the 70s and slept over with all kinds of people? How ridiculous wasn't it then that old Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme became so left-wing despite his upper-class upbringing in affluent Östermalm in downtown Stockholm, and then got assassinated in 1986 largely for that reason? The Tuesday of July 1st, it was finally decided where all soon-to-be 10th graders would end up the coming fall. I ended up at Midgård, and I got real surprised since I had 2 low points. But the required minimum had gone down to 195, which was weird since this was the very first music production class. All minimums were actually from the last school year, so they didn't actually apply for the coming school year. I also got real worried about my future. I really wanted to go to Östra, and I was so close now to ending up there. But I was also somewhat happy that I made it into music production, much due to the low odds. But most of all, I was just glad to start high school, and along with that, a normal class. Just that in and of itself was a huge liberation. Another reason I was glad for having made it into Midgård was that I thought I'd be safer from those girls, which would turn out to not be quite the case later. 2 of them ended up at Torun and another one ended up at Dragonskolan, also known as Dragon. I have no idea where the last one ended up, but at the time I suspected it was Östra. As a result, I felt safe from her since I didn't end up there myself. Most of the other minorities ended up at the 3 schools I mentioned above. Most of those that ended up at Torun were from Oldham. Most of those that ended up at Dragon were from Mariehem/Bräntis. Most of those that ended up at Östra were an even mix of all 3 hoods, the third being Ersboda. I got surprised by the large number of minorities that ended up at Dragon. But at the same time, Dragon was such a large school, about 2,000 students, so the percentage of minorities was still real low. Ustra and Torin got much higher percentages. A few guys ended up at Minerva Gymnasiet, John Bauer and Lilia Skolan, located in neighboring Venice County out west. I looked up John Bauer and was glad to find out that it was located right next to Midgård. Not a single person I knew ended up at Midgård. I already knew that Midgård shared canteen with neighboring schools, so I looked forward to having lunch with these few guys from John Bauer now and then. I was right about that. Now when I could find my way around town, I took the bike all the way to and from Ersbuda, Mariehem and Oldham respectively every week. Each ride took about 75 to 90 minutes. Sometimes I rode around Umedalen right out west from Grubbe. I also took long walks around downtown every Friday and Saturday, which I kept doing all year round during and after high school. The purpose of all this being outdoors was to simply not just stay indoors all the time. It also helped me reflect over my new beef with the girls and my uncertain future caused by it. I also hoped I would bump into somebody I knew now and then, which I also did. Mariehem was built in the 60s and is known for housing the city's water tower. The west side of Mariehem is strictly single-family homes, mostly row houses and some detached ones. The east side is strictly white brick buildings in a typical Million Program architecture, an even mix of rentals and condos. Oldham was built in the 70s and is known for housing a lot of university students mostly living on the north side of Oldham. Ordinary families mainly live on the south side. Both sides are heavily racialized. It's also known for its red brick MP architecture. Oldbacken right to the northwest of Oldham was built in the 60s and has a very mixed architecture. These two hoods are strictly rentals, with exception for a few condo blocks. Ersbuda was built in the 80s and also has a very mixed architecture that doesn't look anything like the Million Program. It's an even mix of all kinds of residences, rentals, condos, row houses and detached single-family homes. Back in the double O's, Ersbuda was also more known than the other hoods for its racialized population. During early June, Oliam's Gordon started being open only on Wednesdays. It started getting empty and eventually I left the place for the summer. I returned during late August when it started being open during weekends again.